Okay, so you want to own a prison. Sounds like the strangest business in the world, and in a way it is. The government arrests people, convicts them, and then hands them to you. You don't advertise. You don't chase customers. You don't compete on price at the checkout counter. The state literally delivers the people to your door, pays you a fixed amount for every one of them every single day, and asks you to do one thing: keep them there. It sounds like the closest thing in modern business to a guaranteed income stream. One kind of customer, delivered by the most powerful institution in the country, with a bill that gets paid by the taxpayer no matter what. Sounds simple. It is not simple. And the story of how private prisons actually make money and how they actually collapse is one of the strangest stories in all of finance. Before you make a single dollar, you need to understand something. In most of the world, you cannot actually buy a prison. Governments almost never sell the building and the sentence along with it. What they sell is a contract. For most of history, prisons were pure government infrastructure, built with taxpayer money, staffed by government employees, owned by the state from the foundation to the fence. Then, starting in the 1980s, something changed. Prison populations in the United States were exploding, states were running out of beds and money at the same time, and a new idea took hold. What if a private company built the prison, ran the prison, and simply charged the government a daily fee for each person held inside it? In 1983, a company called Corrections Corporation of America was founded on exactly that idea. Today, it operates under the name CoreCivic. Its main competitor, the GEO Group, followed the same path. Between them, these two companies came to dominate the entire private prison industry in the country. And here's the first detail that tells you what kind of business this really is. Both of the largest private prison companies in America are not organized as ordinary corporations. For years, they operated as real estate investment trusts, the same structure used by the companies that own shopping malls and office towers. A real estate investment trust is a company that owns income-producing property and is legally required to pay out almost all of its profit to shareholders every year in exchange for not paying corporate income tax on that money. Read that again, because it matters. The companies that lock people up were structured, for tax purposes, the same way as the companies that rent you retail space. To the financial system, a prison bed and a mall storefront are both just square footage that produces a monthly check. The only difference is who is standing on the square footage and whether they are allowed to leave. So how does the money actually arrive? The core of the entire business is something called the per diem. The government agrees to pay the operator a fixed rate for every inmate, per person, per day. That rate might be somewhere around $60 to $80 a day for a typical state prisoner, and it climbs higher for federal detainees and for immigration detention, which can run well over $100 per person per day. Multiply that by a few thousand beds, then multiply it by 365 days a year, and you can see how the numbers get large very quickly. A single facility holding 2,000 people at $70 a day generates roughly $51 million a year in gross revenue before anything else happens. The customer never misses a payment because the customer is the government. But here is where it gets interesting, because the per diem alone is not what makes this business unusual. It is the clause buried inside the contract that most people have never heard of. It is called the occupancy guarantee, and in the industry, it is sometimes described as a lockup quota. When a private operator signs a contract with a state, that contract often does not just say, "We will pay you per prisoner." It says, "We guarantee to keep this prison a certain percentage full, and if we fail to send you enough prisoners, we will pay you anyway." A study of private prison contracts found that a large majority of them contained these guarantees, commonly requiring the state to keep the facility 80 or 90% full. Some contracts went all the way to 100%. 3 prisons in Arizona were reported to carry a 100% occupancy guarantee, meaning the state agreed to pay for every single bed whether a human being was sitting in it or not. Ride that again, because it is the strangest incentive in the whole business. A private prison can get paid for empty beds. If crime falls, If a state sends fewer people to prison, if sentencing gets shorter, the operator still collects because the contract guarantees it. The taxpayer is on the hook to keep the building full or to pay as if it were full. Critics have called this a low crime tax because it means a community can become safer and end up paying more, not less. For the operator, this is the closest thing to the anchor tenant of a shopping mall, except the anchor tenant is a legal obligation written into a government contract. And just like a mall, the moment that guarantee weakens or disappears, the entire financial structure underneath the building can shift without the operator doing anything at all. Now let's back up to the part everyone underestimates. What does it actually cost to get into this business in the first place? Building a prison is not cheap, and it is not fast. A prison is not a warehouse with bunk beds. It is a hardened structure designed to control the movement of every person inside it at all times. Reinforced concrete, steel doors, perimeter fencing, guard towers, surveillance systems covering every hallway, secure medical wings, kitchens that can feed thousands, and control rooms that can lock down the entire facility in seconds. The cost of building a single prison bed can run anywhere from $50,000 to well over $150,000 depending on the security level. A new medium-sized facility can easily cost more than $100 million before it holds a single person, and a large high-security prison can cost several times that. And that money is usually borrowed, which means the interest clock starts ticking the day the loan arrives, not the day the first inmate walks in. And here's a detail about how that building actually gets paid for, because it explains a lot about why prisons keep getting built even in places that arguably don't need them. When a government wants to build a school or a road, it usually has to ask the voters for permission to borrow the money through what are called general obligation bonds. But prisons are frequently financed a different way, through instruments like lease revenue bonds or certificates of participation. The trick is that these do not always require a public vote. A special authority is created, it borrows the money from investors, it builds the prison, and the government agrees to make lease payments that quietly pay the investors back over time. The debt gets structured so that, on paper, it isn't technically the government's debt, it's the authorities. This is how a town of a few thousand people can end up owing tens of millions of dollars for a prison that most of its residents never voted on. It is also how the financial risk gets pushed onto bondholders who are betting, sight unseen, that the beds will fill. When they don't fill, those investors are the ones who lose, which is a detail worth holding on to, because we are going to watch it happen for real in a few minutes. Now here's something almost nobody thinks about when they picture a prison. The shape of the building itself is a financial decision. A prison is designed around one central problem. How do you let the smallest possible number of officers watch the largest possible number of people? Centuries ago, a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham sketched an idea he called the panopticon, a circular building with a single watchtower in the center, arranged so that any inmate could be observed at any moment without ever knowing whether they were actually being watched. The genius of it was economic as much as anything else. One guard could control a crowd through the mere possibility of being seen. Modern prisons are the descendants of that idea. Some are built like the spokes of a wheel, radiating out from a central control point. Others use a design where cells surround a common area with an officer stationed right in the middle. Every one of these layouts is trying to solve the same equation: maximum control with minimum staff, because staff is the biggest cost in the whole operation. And the higher the security level, the more expensive every part of that equation becomes. A minimum security facility is comparatively cheap to build and run. A supermax, where inmates are kept in near total isolation behind multiple layers of steel and concrete and watched almost constantly, can cost a fortune per bed, both to construct and to operate every single day. So, before a single prisoner arrives, the operator has already made a bet on exactly how dangerous the population will be and gotten locked into the cost structure that comes with that bet. Say you've built it, or you've taken over the contract to run one. Before you collect a clean profit, there is a layer of income most people never think about, and it is where the business gets genuinely aggressive. The per diem pays for holding the person. But a prison is also a captive marketplace in the most literal sense of the word. The people inside cannot shop anywhere else. They cannot switch providers. They cannot walk out and find a better price. And a whole ecosystem of companies exists to make money from that fact. Start with the telephone. For decades, phone calls from prison were one of the most quietly profitable businesses attached to the entire system. A handful of companies with names like Securus and the company now known as Viapath won exclusive contracts to provide phone service inside facilities. And because they were the only option, the price of a phone call could climb to astonishing levels, in some cases close to $1 a minute or more once fees were added. Here is the part that connects it back to the operator. Those phone companies often paid the prison or the government a commission, a cut of every call. So the facility had a direct financial incentive to choose the most expensive phone provider, because the more the families on the outside paid to hear a familiar voice, the more the facility collected. A 15-minute phone call to a child could cost more than a family's entire grocery budget for a meal. This became such a scandal that federal regulators eventually moved to cap the rates, and a law was passed to give the government authority to limit the cost of these calls. But for a long time, the phone on the wall was one of the most reliable money machines in the building. Then there is the commissary. Inside a prison, the small store where inmates buy soap, snacks, instant coffee, stamps, and basic goods is often run by a private contractor, and the prices carry markups the customer has no power to refuse. There are money transfer fees charged to families who send money to loved ones inside. There are charges for video visits, which in some facilities have quietly replaced free in-person visits entirely, turning a family reunion into a paid service. And in some facilities, there is prison labor, where incarcerated people work for a few cents to a few dollars an hour, producing goods or providing services at a labor cost almost no ordinary business on earth could ever match. Layer all of this on top of the per diem, and you start to see why the industry describes a prisoner not just as a cost to be housed, but as a source of revenue that keeps generating from multiple directions at once. And there is one more piece of this business that has quietly become the single most important growth engine of the entire industry, and it is not the traditional prison at all. It is immigration detention. When the government detains people for immigration reasons, it needs somewhere to hold them, and it holds enormous numbers of them in facilities run by the same private operators. For CoreCivic and the GEO Group, contracts with the federal immigration authorities became some of their most valuable business, in part because the per diem rates for immigration detention are often higher than for ordinary state prisoners, and in part because the demand can scale up fast when immigration enforcement ramps up. Here is why this matters to the math. An immigration detainee is often held for a shorter, more uncertain period than a sentenced prisoner, but the daily rate is strong and the beds can fill quickly during an enforcement surge. When the 2021 federal order restricted the Justice Department from renewing private prison contracts, notice what it did not touch: immigration detention. The operators simply leaned harder into the part of the business the order left alone. It was a vivid demonstration of how the whole industry survives. When one government customer pulls back, the companies pivot to whichever arm of the government is still buying beds. The building doesn't care why someone is inside it. The per diem is the same shape either way. So far, the prison sounds like a machine that prints money from every angle. Now here is the other side of the ledger, and it is heavier than most people expect. The single largest cost in running a prison is people. Not the inmates, the staff. Correctional officers, medical personnel, kitchen workers, maintenance crews, administrators, and security. Payroll is by far the biggest recurring expense, and it never stops, because a prison has to be fully staffed 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Every hallway watched, every shift covered, every night the same as the day. And here is the trap that has destroyed the reputation and the contracts of more than one operator. The easiest way to make a prison more profitable in the short term is to cut staff. Fewer officers per inmate means lower payroll and a better-looking number at the end of the quarter. But understaffing a prison is not like understaffing a store. When there are too few officers watching too many people in a hardened building, violence rises, escapes happen, and people get hurt or die. And that leads directly to the second enormous cost: lawsuits and medical liability. A prison is legally responsible for the health and safety of everyone inside it. That means providing medical care, and the population of a prison is often sicker, older, and more medically complex than the general public, which makes health care one of the fastest rising costs in the entire system. When care is inadequate, when someone dies from a preventable condition, when violence spirals out of control because there weren't enough officers on duty, the operator can face investigations, massive legal settlements, and the loss of the contract itself. Insurance for this kind of liability is expensive and getting more so. Add in utilities for a building that runs constantly, food for thousands of people 3 times a day, maintenance on a structure that is being used around the clock by people who sometimes have every reason to damage it, and the monthly operating bill for a single facility can run into the millions before a single dollar goes toward paying down the loan used to build the place. This is not a hypothetical. There was a facility in Idaho, run by the largest private prison company in the country, that became so violent it earned a nickname among inmates and staff. They called it Gladiator School. The problem, according to years of reporting and litigation, traced back to that exact temptation: cutting staff to protect the margin. With too few officers on the floor, violence between inmates spiraled, and the company eventually admitted that it had understaffed the prison and logged thousands of hours as covered when the guard posts were actually empty. On paper, the shifts looked staffed. In reality, nobody was there. The state of Idaho ultimately took the prison back under government control, and federal investigators got involved. Think about what that means as a business outcome. The very move that made the quarterly numbers look better, fewer people on payroll, is what cost the company the entire contract. The savings were real and immediate. The consequences were larger and arrived later. That is the shape of almost every disaster in this industry. A cost you can see today, traded against a risk you can't see until it detonates. And here's the counterintuitive part that catches new operators completely off guard. A full prison can still lose money. This is the detail almost nobody sees coming. It is not just about how many beds are occupied. It is about the gap between the per diem you collect and the true cost of holding each person safely and legally. If the state is paying you $70 a day per inmate, but the real cost of adequate staffing, proper medical care, and a facility that doesn't generate lawsuits comes to more than $70 a day, then every occupied bed is quietly losing money. Occupancy is not the same thing as profit. An operator can run a prison that is 100% full and still bleed cash because the government negotiated a rate that only works if you cut corners, and cutting corners is exactly what generates the lawsuits that wipe out the savings. That distinction between a full building and a profitable one is where a lot of prison operators have gotten into serious trouble. Let us actually run the numbers, because the math is where the whole illusion either holds up or falls apart. Say you operate a facility with 2,000 beds, and your contract pays you $70 per inmate per day with a 90% occupancy guarantee. 90% of 2,000 is 1,800 people you are guaranteed to be paid for. 1,800 times $70 is $126,000 a day, which across a full year comes to just under $46 million in guaranteed base revenue. Add the extra layers on top, a slice of the phone commissions, the commissary markups, the various fees, and call it another few million. So far, this looks wonderful. Now start subtracting. Correctional officers and staff for a facility this size, running 24 hours a day with multiple shifts, can easily cost $25 to $30 million a year in payroll alone. Inmate health care for 2,000 people, a population that is often older and sicker than average, can run into the millions and is rising every year. Then food, utilities for a building that never sleeps, maintenance, insurance, and the loan payments on the 100 million plus you borrowed to build the place. By the time you finish subtracting, the comfortable $46 million cushion has been squeezed down to a thin margin, and every one of those cost lines is under pressure to grow. Now watch how fast it turns. Suppose the state renegotiates and drops your per diem from $70 to $60. That is a $10 cut per person per day, which sounds small. Across 1,800 guaranteed inmates, it erases over $6.5 million of revenue in a single year. And your costs do not fall to match because you still have to staff, feed, and treat the same number of people. Or suppose a wave of lawsuits over conditions forces you to add staff and pay a large settlement in the same year your healthcare costs spike. The margin that looked healthy can flip to a loss with almost no warning. This is the volatility hiding underneath a business that markets itself as boringly predictable. The revenue is capped by a government that controls your one and only customer relationship, and the costs are pushed upward by lawsuits, by medical inflation, by the simple fact that human beings are expensive and dangerous to hold. The difference between a good year and a bad year on the same building can be enormous, and the operator controls almost none of the variables that decide which one it gets. To understand how badly this can go, it helps to look at one real building, from the day it was dreamed up to the day the money vanished. In the small town of Hardin, Montana, population only a few thousand, local leaders came up with what looked like a brilliant plan in the mid-2000s. They would build a jail. Not because Hardin had a crime problem, it didn't, but because prisons had become an industry, and towns across the country were being told the same thing. If you build it, the prisoners will come. Hardin borrowed roughly $27 million through bonds to construct a modern detention facility with around 460 beds, betting that once it was built, some government agency would sign a contract to fill it. The facility was completed. The doors worked. The beds were made. And then nothing happened. No state agency, no federal agency, no county sent a single inmate. The prison sat completely empty. Not underused, empty. It never held one prisoner. What happened next reads less like a finance story and more like a warning. With no inmates and no revenue, the town could not pay back the bonds, and the investors who had lent the money lost most of it. Desperate to fill the building, the town entertained increasingly strange proposals. At one point, there was a plan to house detainees from Guantanamo Bay, which went nowhere and drew national outrage. At another point, a mysterious company with a vaguely official-sounding name and a man in a uniform arrived promising to take over the facility and fill it, only for the whole arrangement to collapse amid revelations about the man's questionable background. The empty prison in Hardin became a symbol of an entire era, a monument to a simple and dangerous assumption. That demand for prison beds was permanent, guaranteed, and only ever going up. Keep Hardin in mind if you ever think a prison contract is a sure thing. The building was perfect. The math was fine on paper. The one thing nobody could actually guarantee was the one thing the whole plan depended on: people to put inside it. Because here is the structural risk that runs through this entire industry, and it is the reason a private prison can look healthy one year and be in freefall the next. The business does not depend on the operator being good at running prisons. It depends on the government's demand for prison beds staying high. And that demand is not a law of nature. It is a policy choice, and policy choices change. For most of the late 20th century, the American prison population rose almost without interruption, and the private prison industry rose with it. But then several things shifted at once. Crime rates fell in many places. States started passing sentencing reforms to reduce how many people they locked up and for how long. Public opinion began to turn against mass incarceration. And most dramatically, in early 2021, the federal government issued an executive order directing the Department of Justice not to renew its contracts with private prison operators. For companies that had built entire business lines around federal contracts, this was the equivalent of a shopping mall's anchor tenant announcing it was leaving all at once across multiple buildings. Their stock prices took the hit. Their future revenue suddenly had a question mark hanging over it. This is the structural truth underneath the whole industry. A private prison does not fail because it is badly run. It fails because the thing it was built to depend on, a steady stream of people delivered by the government, was never actually promised for the long term. One executive order, one wave of sentencing reform, one shift in immigration policy, one state deciding to bring its prisons back under government control, and the floor can move under an operator who did absolutely nothing wrong in the day-to-day management of the building. The company is not really in control of its own demand. It is renting that demand from politics, and politics does not sign a 99-year lease. And there is one more uncomfortable feature of the economics that is worth stating plainly, because it sits at the center of the whole debate around this industry. In an ordinary business, a customer who never comes back is a failure. In this business, a customer who comes back is revenue. A large share of people released from prison end up incarcerated again within a few years, and every one of those returns is another stream of per diem payments arriving at somebody's door. Now, no serious operator will say out loud that it wants people to return, and the companies point to re-entry and education programs they fund. But look at the raw structure of the incentive, not the press release. The business is paid to hold people, not to keep them from coming back. Reducing the number of people who return would, all else equal, shrink the pool of future customers. When a business gets paid by the occupied bed and the same faces keep filling those beds year after year, the thing the model quietly rewards is not rehabilitation. It is repetition. This is exactly why the private prison industry is one of the most controversial businesses in the country, and why the political winds that decide its fortunes can turn so hard and so fast. It is not just a company holding a building. It is a company whose revenue rises when a society fails to fix the very problem the prison was supposed to address. So does owning a prison actually work as a business? The honest answer depends entirely on the contract and the moment in history, and the gap between the good outcome and the bad outcome is enormous. In the optimistic scenario, you hold a facility in a state with a rising or stable inmate population, a per diem rate that comfortably covers your real costs, and a rock-solid occupancy guarantee that pays you whether the beds are full or not. On top of that base, you collect the extra layers, the phone commissions, the commissary markups, the transfer fees, the labor. In that world, a prison is one of the most predictable income streams imaginable, a building the government is contractually committed to keep sending money to, month after month, year after year. This is the outcome that turned two prison companies into billion-dollar enterprises traded on the stock market. At their scale, these operators run dozens of facilities at once and generate revenue measured in the billions of dollars a year, spreading the risk of any single lost contract across a whole portfolio of buildings exactly the way a mall-owning company spreads the risk of any single dead mall. That diversification is precisely what a town like Hardin, betting everything on one empty building, never had. When you own 50 facilities, one bad contract is a bruise. When you own one facility and it stays empty, one bad contract is the end. In the realistic bad scenario, the picture inverts completely. Crime falls, and sentencing reform empties beds the state no longer wants to pay for. An occupancy guarantee expires and does not get renewed. A wave of lawsuits over understaffing and inadequate medical care drains cash and damages the company's reputation. The federal government or a single large state announces it is walking away from private prisons entirely. And meanwhile, the fixed costs do not shrink to match because the building still has to be staffed, maintained, insured, and secured, whether it is full or half empty. The bonds used to build it still come due every month. Just like Hardin, the operator can be left holding a hardened, expensive, purpose-built structure that is almost impossible to convert into anything else, generating far less than it costs to keep the lights on. Neither of these scenarios is exotic or theoretical. Both of them have happened across the same industry, sometimes to the same company only a few years apart. A prison, from the outside, looks like a building. From the inside, financially, it is something much stranger. It is a business whose entire revenue depends not on a product it makes or a service people choose to buy, but on how many human beings a government decides to lock up and on a contract that treats those human beings as a guaranteed line of income. The operator doesn't control crime. The operator doesn't control sentencing law. The operator doesn't control public opinion or the next election. It controls a building, and it hopes the demand keeps arriving. So if you ever find yourself thinking a prison is the ultimate recession-proof investment, remember what you are actually buying. You are not buying a building. You are buying a bet that a society will keep needing more cages forever. And the moment that bet stops paying, the building doesn't fill with something else. It just sits there, exactly like the empty prison in Hardin, a perfect structure built for a demand that never came.